I had always believed that a mother's love was unconditional, that no wealth, no success, no pride could ever make a child forget the sacrifices that shaped him. For 25 years I had given everything, my youth, my ambitions, even my health, to ensure my son could have a life I never had. I worked 2 jobs, cooked his favorite meals, stayed awake when he had nightmares, and celebrated every small victory as if it were my own. And yet, the moment he inherited $40 million, everything changed. He didn't call. He didn't invite me over to share in his joy. The next thing I knew, a cold, polished envelope was shoved into my hands, along with a few of my belongings he claimed were all I deserved. "Mom, you're a burden," he said without hesitation, his eyes devoid of warmth. "Go live somewhere else. I've earned this life on my own. You don't belong here anymore." I stared at him, feeling my heart shatter in slow, unbearable pieces. The son I had nurtured, guided, and protected had turned into a stranger overnight, a young man blinded by wealth and arrogance, ungrateful for every sleepless night I had endured on his behalf. I tried to speak, to remind him of the years I had sacrificed, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I convince someone who believed money erased every tie of love and loyalty that I had been the foundation of everything he now owned? With nothing left to say, I gathered my few belongings and stepped out into the cold evening air. The streets were alive with laughter and life, yet I felt invisible, discarded like an old coat no longer needed. For the first time in decades, I realized that the world could be cruel, and the cruelty could come from your own child. That night, as I sat alone in a small, dimly lit room a friend had offered me, I let myself cry. But beneath the tears, a spark began to form, a quiet, simmering resolve. If he thought he could break me, he had never truly known the strength of a mother's love. Betrayal had cut deep, but it had not destroyed me. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I vowed that the story wasn't over, that one day the boy who threw me out would understand the price of underestimating a mother's heart. The first night in a stranger's guest room was colder than I had imagined. I could hear the distant laughter of families and the hum of life outside, a cruel reminder that I had no place in the world I had built for my son. Every corner of my mind replayed his words, "You're a burden." The sting of rejection was sharp, gnawing at my chest like a relentless winter wind. For 3 days I wandered between cafes, libraries, and quiet parks, searching not just for a roof over my head, but for a way to make sense of what had happened. Friends offered brief comfort, a warm meal, a couch to sleep on. But I felt the gnawing emptiness of being truly abandoned by my own child. The streets, once familiar, now felt alien, full of strangers whose eyes seemed to weigh the story I could not explain. I had hit rock bottom, and yet in that desolation, something unexpected began to grow. I remembered the life lessons I had tried to teach my son: resilience, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth. If he thought I would crumble, he had underestimated me. Late one evening, sitting on a worn park bench under a flickering street lamp, I began to think. $40 million, it was not just a number. It was a web of businesses, contracts, and investors. And somewhere in that web, there would be a crack, a weakness that even the most arrogant young man could not navigate without guidance. A plan began to form, not born from spite, but from clarity. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would reclaim my dignity, quietly, strategically, in a way that would show him the value of the one person he had thrown away. As I closed my eyes that night, shivering under the thin blanket a kind neighbor had lent me, I felt a flicker of hope. The pain of rejection had sharpened my mind instead of breaking my spirit. I would rise from this low point not with anger, but with cunning and patience. And when the time came, he would learn that a mother's love is powerful, but a mother's intelligence, resolve, and quiet revenge are even stronger. After the cold shock of being turned out, my night shifted from sleepless grief to silent study. I traded pity for paper, balance sheets, contract clauses, press releases, anything that touched the name he now wore like armor. I had never been schooled in finance, but I knew people. I had spent a lifetime listening, learning, and sewing together fragments of knowledge. That would be enough. I started small. I visited the neighborhood library and spent hours at a public terminal, reading articles about the company that now carried my son's name on its letterhead. I called old acquaintances, Mr. Curran from the factory, a woman who had once managed payroll, a retired lawyer who owed me a favor for tutoring his niece. Each call was careful, casual, a web spun to gather threads. Nobody suspected the woman on the other end was the same mother who had been told to leave. Piece by piece, the picture emerged. His fortune sat on fragile foundations, a flashy franchise deal that depended on one key supplier, a fragile partnership with a private investor impatient for returns, and an exclusive contract with a hospital trust that could be renegotiated if certain standards were not met. Most damaging of all, his public image was brittle, bought with glamour, not gratitude. If one corner crumbled, the rest might follow. Revenge, I decided, would not be a scream. It would be a lesson delivered with precision. I wasn't interested in ruin. I wanted accountability. I wanted him to stand where I had stood, stripped of pride, and understand what it meant to be indispensable to the life he'd taken for granted. So I built a plan with 3 quiet moves. First, I reconnected with the one supplier he had dismissed in a hurry. I visited their modest warehouse under the pretense of inquiring about a job for a neighbor. I listened. I learned that the supplier had been squeezed for faster delivery and lower margins since my son's takeover. I offered a solution that required nothing more than my presence, an honest mediation, a face they respected. Old respect, I found, still counted in business halls. Second, I found a way to touch his investor's temper. The private investor was proud, protective of legacy and reputation. I began a whisper campaign, not lies, only gentle reminders of the company's shaky compliance history. The irregularities the investor had been told were under control. I did it through the people the investor trusted. A charity board member, a retired auditor I had once assisted. The result was inevitable. The investor called for a review, not out of spite, but out of prudent fear. Third, and most delicately, I reopened the door to the hospital trust. I volunteered at a local clinic and let my care speak louder than my name. There I learned the hospital's true needs: patient relations, community outreach, a simple but overlooked requirement in the contract my son's company had promised to meet. I wrote clear, well-phrased suggestions and passed them anonymously to the trust. They noticed. They began to ask questions. I moved like a shadow, leaving no fingerprints, only ideas that grew into pressure. I watched as calls multiplied, as partners requested meetings, as the man who had once thrown me out began to feel the heat of a network tightening. My heart did not race with malice. It beat steady with the calm of someone making things right through intellect rather than insult. One evening, as rain tapped the window of the small room I now rented, I allowed myself a small, private smile. I had not humiliated him publicly. I had not destroyed him. But I had set the course so that when he finally turned to me, and he would find me composed, unbent, and holding the one thing he would need most, the skill and grace he had dismissed as weakness. The stage was set. Now all I needed was the moment when my son, armed with money but not wisdom, would come back to the only person who had ever truly loved him and ask for help. It happened sooner than I expected. 3 days after I had set the subtle gears of my plan in motion, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was hesitant, trembling with a mixture of fear and shame. "Mom, I need your help," he stammered, the arrogance, the entitlement, the coldness that had pushed me out, all gone. For the first time in years, I heard a man stripped bare, vulnerable, realizing that money alone could not fix what he had broken. I walked into the boardroom that afternoon, calm and composed. He rose, eyes wide, lips parted, searching for the words that would explain why the world he had built was now teetering on the edge. I didn't answer him immediately. I simply watched the man who had once called me a burden fumble with contracts, investors, and missed deadlines. "You need guidance," I said finally, voice steady, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every small kindness he had ever taken for granted. "And I will help, but only on my terms." I began methodically, navigating the tangled web of his business. I spoke to investors, recalibrated agreements, soothed tempers, and re-established trust. Every nod, every grateful glance from his partners reminded me that I held the power not in anger, but in knowledge, patience, and love. He watched silently, his pride shrinking with every solution I offered. For the first time, he realized that wealth without wisdom is fragile, and that the foundation of everything he valued had always been me. When we finally stepped out of the final meeting, the office empty, he lowered his head. "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice carried regret, desperation, and an understanding he had never had before. I smiled gently, not cruelly. "Apologies are easy. Respect is earned, and you've just begun to understand what it means to rely on someone who truly cares for you." In that moment, I didn't feel triumph born of vengeance. I felt the quiet satisfaction of a lesson learned without bitterness, a poetic justice wrapped in dignity. He had begged for my help, and I had given it, but under my terms. He had realized that love, guidance, and wisdom are far more valuable than the 40 million he had flaunted. That night, as I returned to my small apartment, I felt lighter than I had in days. The pain of rejection had been replaced with clarity, the humiliation replaced with quiet strength. I had been thrown out, underestimated, dismissed, but in the end, I had shown him the irreplaceable power of a mother's heart. Revenge, I discovered, is sweetest when served with patience, intelligence, and love, and the look in his eyes, humble, awed, grateful, was the only reward I would ever need.